Okay, so now we're on chapter 3 called The First Half of Life. And as you remember from the first two chapters, Richard talks about what he calls the container. And first half of life really refers to this process where we are kind of establishing our identity, establishing who we think we are. That could be our culture, our gender, our career, our community. That's kind of how we all kind of start off in life, is kind of defining who we are. And he gives some examples about how oftentimes when we're teenagers, sometimes we are going through that process of letting people know like who we're not, right? We are beginning to form our identity, what we think we are all about. And sometimes we get trapped a little bit later in life thinking that we are our schooling or we are our career. And we've talked about how that can lead to serious problems later on, because the moment you have lost that career or you've lost that thing, then sometimes our identity can fall apart. So anyways, the first half of life is essentially just that really important process of establishing our identity, who we are. And this chapter goes into detail on a little bit about why this first half of life is important and how it can be set up properly. As I was reading through this chapter last week, I realized that it was kind of broken up into kind of 5 main sections. So in the introduction, Richard talks about the importance of law and boundaries while growing up, and how these boundaries, or what Richard calls containers, give us security. They help us with impulse control. They provide structure for us. And these things are really needed to help us become healthy people. And it can also help us later on in life let go of our ego more easily if the law and the boundaries are done properly. And then the second section of this chapter is called Conditional and Unconditional Love. In that section, Richard talks about the importance of receiving conditional and unconditional love from authority figures, and how both of those types of love can work together really, really nicely. And then the third section is around holding a creative tension. And this is where Richard begins talking about the importance of law and freedom and living under both of them. He says that this tension requires us to learn how to respect and thrive under law and freedom, which he calls a paradox, like being able to live within both these two polar opposites. He says we must know the rules and the ability to freely critique and break the rules. And then the fourth section is called First Half Done Poorly. And in that section, he talks about what happens when we're not given the proper boundaries. We're not given a proper modeling of what that structure should look like. And so he talks about the misuse of law and authority, or living with too much freedom or too much law, and how that can be damaging to our personal development. He says that basically that the abuse of law can lead to abuse, and that can take away our self-confidence and eventually lead us to hate law and authority, whereas too much freedom can lead us to addictions, vanity, self-harming behavior, which can lead us to eventually feel a need to embrace law and structure. And so he talks about kind of those paths. And in the last section of this chapter, he talks about discharging your loyal soldier. And this is kind of the beginning of how we experience failure, like deep, really hard failure, fallings, trauma. He calls it discharging your loyal soldier, because this is where we realize that the container that we have, our identity, will not sometimes be useful in helping us deal with those very, very hard moments. He says, basically, at some point, we are all going to face very, very difficult moments. For example, trauma, death, severe illness of ourselves, of loved ones, and those moments can shake us to our core. We might not even know how to move on during those times. We don't feel equipped to handle the trauma. We were never prepared for it, and we couldn't be prepared because each of us have those moments, oftentimes by ourselves, and no one can understand the pain that we're feeling during those times. And Richard talks about how in these major transitions in life, where we're going into these major seasons of trauma or coming out of those seasons, he says that we need closure, and that closure can help us let go. And he says that letting go process can feel a lot like a loss of faith or a loss of self. It's a feeling of the thing that I believed about myself or God even wasn't helpful or needed to be updated to be able to process the things that we went through. And he says that it's only the process of letting the false self die. But I guess this process of letting go is this process of letting the false self or the first half container kind of fall apart. And this is when, what Richard says, the true soul, the true self is kind of born, or we're made aware of it. I guess by letting go is how we can move into what Richard calls the second half of life, which is going to be filled with further growth, a further journey, compassion, inclusion, a deeper understanding of trust, risk, and surrender. So that's how the chapter is broken up. And I thought we would just kind of go through some specific paragraphs that I think, well, at least they speak to me, and I wanted to share them with you. But I think that it's a good structure for the first half of life to talk about what it is, the importance of it, the importance of law and boundaries, the importance of conditional love and unconditional love, and also how many of us are growing up in homes or societies or communities where maybe the first half of life, the structure we were handed, the way that we saw these things modeled in our parents or those around us, maybe we were abused, maybe we didn't see proper examples. And so Richard talks about how in those instances, for many of us, like moving into the second half of life is much harder for us. There isn't as easy of a transition because we didn't have the first half of life set up properly for us. And I know that I'm talking a lot of metaphor, and I apologize, but I'm just using the words that Richard is using, which is basically this idea of the structure, the identity, our ego that we have built for ourselves in the first section, which is going to be largely impacted by our experiences, those around us, our own culture, the time period that we live in. All those things are going to impact us. And Richard says that those things can hold us back from moving into the second half of life, or they can help us move easily into it. So let's move into the first section, which is the introduction, where he talks about the importance of boundaries. And he says the containers, again, that's law, tradition, custom, the boundaries. He says the containers give us the necessary security continuity, predictability, impulse control, and ego structure that we need before the chaos of real life shows up. He later says, without law in some form, and also without butting up against the law, we cannot move forward easily and naturally. Period. We all know that proper boundaries and rules are super important for us, right? These rules that are often given by our parents, by authority figures, by teachers. These rules can help us live peacefully with others and can also help us to stay physically and emotionally safe. We go through stages in our life when we decide to challenge specific rules, right? Oftentimes when we are like 2, call them the terrible 2s, we might fight against authority figures, fight against our parents. We're challenging the rules. And then, of course, like later on when we become teenagers, many of us will challenge the authority, challenge our parents' thinking, challenge why we're doing certain things, right? And that's all part of growing up. Sometimes the rules that have been set out for us, they don't seem fair to us anymore. Or the rule seems arbitrary. We don't quite understand it. It doesn't make sense to us, or we just plain out don't like it. And so we challenge the rules, and then sometimes we will break the rule. Sometimes we break the rule because we're just curious, like what will happen to us if we break the rule. We were wondering if we're going to face any severe consequences, either from breaking that rule or from the penalty of breaking the rule from our parents or authority figures. The rules, these boundaries, if set up properly, can teach us how to live. And challenging or breaking those rules will sometimes teach us even more why those rules are in place. Now, later on, we'll get into what happens when the rules that we've been given are not proper rules. And we're talking about rules that are good for us, rules that keep us safe physically, emotionally. We're just talking about those kind of rules, those proper boundaries. There are certainly times when we're given rules maybe that are totally not good for us. And it is right to challenge those rules and to break those rules. But Richard's not talking about those types of rules. He's talking about proper rules that are there to protect us. Later on, Richard says, law and tradition seem to be necessary in any spiritual system, both to reveal and to limit our basic egocentricity, and to make at least some community, family, and marriage possible. It structures children's universe and gives them foundational meaning and safety. Without laws like the Ten Commandments, our existence here on this earth would be pretty pathetic, period. So I think we all can agree that proper laws are good for us. They help us stay in line. They help society stay in line. You think of rules like thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder. Those are all proper rules that we should all abide by. I mean, imagine a society that didn't abide by those basic rules. Richard then goes on to talk about the paradox of building a strong ego in order to let it go. So now Richard moves into this idea that this very strong container, if set up properly, can help us go through these transitions, these very difficult seasons. He says, you need a very strong container to hold the contents and contradictions that arrive later in life. You ironically need a very strong ego structure to let go of your ego. You need to struggle with the rules more than a bit before you throw them out. And all of this builds a strong self that can positively obey Jesus and die to self, period. So this idea of needing a strong ego in order to let it go is a difficult concept for me. I was trying to research it, like what it means and I still don't quite understand it. So here's what I wrote down as I was trying to process and understand how all this works. We need a strong sense of self, a strong ego to protect us. A strong self helps us to speak our minds, and it helps us to take care of our own needs. This ego gives us confidence to navigate and explore. It gives us courage to move outside of our comfort zone. Over time, we may let go of our own ego, our own desires, our own needs, our desire to be selfish, and move into a place where we begin to pursue helping and serving others, sacrificing ourselves to help others. And this is that idea that Jesus talks about, denying ourselves, right? Denying our own impulses and taking up what Jesus says, our cross to follow Jesus, which is essentially a call for us to love God and to love others. And so this idea of taking up our cross, following Jesus, which essentially is loving God and loving others more than ourselves. In order for that to happen, because in order for us to truly love others, then we have to have loved ourselves. This is where ego structure is important. It's hard to love others if we don't love ourselves first, right? Which is why a strong ego and self-love needs to be formed first. And then we can love others properly without burning ourselves out in the process. Because if we're not taking care of ourselves, how can we take care of others? And if we're just in this mode of just giving everything of ourselves to other people, and we're not re-energizing ourselves, we're not taking care of ourselves, then we're not going to do a very good job of taking care of others, at least for a very long time. There's no way we'll be able to physically handle it, mentally handle it, if we're not taking care of ourselves. So it's a really interesting idea here. So anyways, that's how I was kind of processing it, this idea of you need to have a proper sense of self in order for you to properly be able to let it go. And when I say let it go, I mean like giving of yourself to others, realizing that we are here to love and include and be compassionate towards other people, and finding ways to do that. But also in that process of helping others, we need to also make sure that we are taking care of ourselves, which is why the strong ego is important early on. And that will then help us to then take care of others. That's how I'm processing it. I could be totally getting this wrong, so I apologize. But that's how I'm kind of understanding it. It's a very complex issue for me, so I don't quite understand all of it. But that's how I'm kind of getting through it. And then Richard gets into how tradition can teach us about breaking rules, like basically learning from the past. How people in the past have taught us through either breaking the rules or recovering from the falling. Richard says, I think we all need some help from the perennial tradition. Life is far too short, and there are plenty of mistakes we do not need to make, and some that we need to make. We are parts of social and family ecosystems that are rightly structured to keep us from falling, but also, more important, to show us how to fall, and also how to learn from that falling, period. And I don't know about you, but I always love watching like documentaries, biographies on people's lives. I like to read biographies. I like to read history. And I think what intrigues me about it is just seeing how other people have lived, how other people have gone through difficult periods, how they kind of processed it, how they got through it. Like that, I learn a lot from that. And I think that's what Richard's saying here, is that we can learn a lot from those who have gone before us. And I guess this is one of the reasons why I'm really attracted to this book, because Richard's talking about kind of the movement between first half of life and second half of life. And that's very interesting to me. I mean, what better way to kind of understand this than to actually read it from somebody else who has kind of gone through it. And I also like this idea that we tend to learn more from watching someone recover after a major falling. That we can learn so much from watching the saints of old, reading about their lives, reading about how they have gone through difficult periods. I just was going through my library and I saw there's a book that I have by C.S. Lewis called A Grief Observed. And I've only read parts of it, but the book was written, I believe, as his wife was dying or his wife had just died. And that book is really him kind of processing that grief on how he was dealing with it. And like, those are the books. Those are the types of things that help us to deal with our own falling, our own traumatic moments, by reading about how other people have kind of processed it or gone through it. It can be very, very helpful, especially when they've gone through that process and come on the other side in a healthy way. There are certainly things that we can also learn on the opposite spectrum, where someone goes through a traumatic event and then maybe it doesn't take the best path. They don't take the most physically, emotionally healthy path. Maybe they go into a season of drug abuse or self-harm or other things like that. And we can certainly learn from that as well. But I think reading history, from reading biographies from those who have maybe gone through and learned well from those experiences can be super helpful. Richard goes on and says, "We are not helping our children by always preventing them from what might be necessary falling, because you learn how to recover from falling by falling. It is precisely by falling off the bike many times that you eventually learn what the balance feels like. People who have never allowed themselves to fall are actually off balance while not realizing it at all, period." I thought this was a really interesting paragraph, and I underlined necessary falling. That Richard's talking about how some of these things in life are absolutely necessary, that we have to feel what it's like to fall in order to stay balanced. It's a very interesting idea. And as I was kind of processing through this, here's what I wrote. I said, falling is a part of life, and learning how to get back up and recover can only happen by actually falling. It's not ideal, but that's the only way we learn. And this is also how we can develop a deeper form of empathy and understanding when other people fall around us, because it's happened to us. We know what it feels like. And we may be helpful in those moments to guide them in their own recovery process. Those who have fallen, Richard says, are actually more balanced now. They've sensed it. They've fallen down. They know what it feels like to be kind of wobbly on the bike. And it's from having that feeling of being wobbly from falling that we learn how to quickly, shift our bodies, shift our minds to stay on the bike. So I think the bike metaphor is a really interesting one about you can only learn how to be balanced by actually falling and having that sense of getting a bit wobbly or maybe even falling sometimes. And then that recovery by getting back on the bike. Like, now we've learned about how much to the right or how much to the left we can actually move in order to stay more balanced. It's an interesting metaphor. I like it. And I know I'm just kind of, I hope I'm interpreting this right, going through this book. And this is why I really appreciate this book, is because there's so many nuggets like that. You're going through this chapter and there's all these like passages like this metaphor of being on a bike, and, where we're just talking about necessary falling and how you recover from falling by falling. Like, those are just really interesting passages to me that I have to sit there and kind of think about, like, what that means for me. And so I hope that as I'm kind of going through this book with you, that I'm getting some of that here. A lot of this is hard for me to understand, but this is how I'm kind of understanding it right now. And then Richard talks about conditional and unconditional love. This is like another section in this chapter. And in this section, Richard talks about the benefits of receiving both conditional love and unconditional love from our authority figures, from our parents. And this was interesting to me because I've always thought that unconditional love was really where it was at. That conditional love seemed very harsh. And I don't like the idea of only displaying love to somebody if they do certain things. But I guess there's different types of conditional love. I was like Googling this yesterday about types of conditional love, and I was reading an article in Psychology Today about proper uses of conditional love. Anyways, again, another one of the sections that I'm kind of trying to understand. But here's the paragraph in this section that stood out to me. Richard says, "We all seem to think we need nothing but unconditional love. Any law, correction, rule, or limitation is another word for conditional love." It's interesting to me that very clear passages describing both God's conditional love and also God's unconditional love are found in the same scriptures like Deuteronomy and John's Gospel. The only real biblical promise is that unconditional love will have the last word, period. And so in this section, Richard talks about how important it is to have both aspects in our lives. And Richard gives the examples of how when growing up, he received conditional love from his mom, who I guess seemed to be enforcing the rules, and then unconditional love from his dad. But he talked about having that kind of balance of like good cop, bad cop was really important in his own formation. Now, many of us don't have that growing up, right? And sometimes we have one parental figure who is trying to give us both. But anyways, I thought it was interesting about the importance of having both conditional and unconditional love. And Richard equates the conditional love to any sort of law and what happens to us when we break the law. So, Richard cites the Old Testament law and what happened if you broke the law versus kind of gospel and grace and kind of the all-consuming unconditional love that God gives to all of us, like that beautiful love. And I love that Richard points out that we know that grace and unconditional love is the winner here. And then the next section is called Holding a Creative Tension. Richard says, mature people invariably thank their harder parent, the law-driven church, the kick-ass coach, and most demanding professors, but usually years later. Some, of course, have also been wounded quite lethally, as in situations of abuse, and it takes them a longer time to heal and to grow, period. I thought that was a really interesting idea here as Richard begins to move into kind of the proper forms of how conditional love or law can help us, how it can challenge us later in life. And I don't know about you, but there are certain people that I think about. There are certain teachers that I've had, certain coaches that I've had, and even bosses at work who have challenged me, who have given me very, very hard rules to follow and pushed me beyond what I thought I was capable of. And man, I've had just tremendous growth from those people. And Richard would say that those are the people who are kind of enforcing this conditional love. Like, in order for you to do well in this sport or in this task, you need to do it this way. Otherwise, I'm not going to be very pleased. Right? That's that conditional love. But when done properly, that can totally challenge us. It could challenge us to grow in so many ways. And I remember being in college and having this one teacher who was just super hard. And I remember working on this paper, and out of all my subjects, the only thing that I felt I did good at was English literature, because I like to write and I love to read. And when I was in junior college, like, I tended to do well in my writing classes. And when I moved over to university, I was in a new area. I had much hard. I was in a classroom with really smart students, and I had professors who were really, really hard. They wanted to see the best from us. And I remember my very first writing assignment in this class, I worked super hard. I probably put 40 hours at least into this paper. And this is just the first paper in the class. And we had probably 6 papers that we had to do for this class. And so I really wanted to start it off right. And I worked really, really hard on this paper, turned it in, and I ended up getting I think barely a C. And I was devastated. I had worked so hard. And I remember crying, walking back to my dorm room. I remember crying on campus because I felt like, man, if this is the best I can do, this is like the very first paper I'm doing at university and I'm getting a C minus, I'm in trouble. And also I felt like, man, what I thought I was good at, I guess not. And I had some friends who had spent maybe 2 or 3 hours on their paper and got higher grades than me. And I felt that, man, this is so unfair. I just can't, I'm not equipped. Anyways, that led me to a season of working with my professor and working with my teacher's aide on how I can better write, how to better construct my papers and be a better writer. And it was super challenging. I learned so much in that class, more than I would have with a gracious teacher. Isn't that interesting? That I grew and I was that challenge. I still remember today. That was years ago. This is over 20 years ago, and I'm still talking about this. Authorities and teachers who expect a lot from us can be huge motivators for us. They can help us to see things that we don't see in ourselves. And this is also, I think, the role of a good mentor. They challenge us. They help us to think outside of what we think is possible. And they also tell us when they think that they're not very happy with our work, that there are ways that we can do it better. And that can be very hurtful at times, right? I mean, I was crying with that paper, and here I was, an adult college student, crying. And I think when this type of challenge, this type of conditional love, whatever you want to call it, the harder parent, the really strict teacher, when done properly, that can accelerate our growth like nothing else. And through that process, through that really painful process, as we're getting refined, as we're working harder, as we are building skills, getting stronger, that helps us gain confidence, belief in ourselves, and to improve in that thing, whatever it is. But again, it has to be done right. And so many times we see examples of people who are just there to break other people down. Right? There are definitely the hard parents and also the law-driven churches out there that are mainly there just to break people down and not to build them up. And so it's a very delicate, and Richard calls it a creative tension. It has to be done right. It has to be born out of love and compassion. Otherwise, if the person is just being hard on the person, just to give them a hard time, and there's no love there, then that can just cause a person to really just hate either that task or you, and it's not going to help that person grow at all. In fact, it's going to do the opposite, may have them not even continue. I think about examples of kids who are studying music, and maybe their parents are pushing them every single week to keep improving whatever it is that they're playing. And at some point, the parent or the child just rebels. Like, they're tired of playing that instrument. They're tired of learning. Like, they've been pushed beyond to the point where they don't care anymore, right? So there is that, what Richard says, that creative tension. And Richard says, I'm trying to place you and then hold you inside a very creative tension. If you will allow yourself to be held there, I do promise you it is a creative tension, because both law and freedom are necessary for spiritual growth. But very few Christians have been taught how to live both law and freedom at the same time. Our Western dualistic minds do not process paradoxes very well, period. So this is where Richard's talking about this idea of living within these boundaries of law and grace, and appreciating them both when they're done properly, right? When the parents, when those authority figures are properly practicing how to be hard and yet how to be loving at the same time. And that we see that the motivation for that parent being hard, or for that church, or whatever it is, your boss, like, the ultimate motivation is that that person wants to see more from you. They want to see you grow and develop, and it's born out of that love. That's really where, if you want to get that tension right, that tension of law and grace, that tension of being hard and also being loving, like, it's got to be born from love, essentially. So in this next section called First Half Done Poorly, Richard is going to talk about what happens when we are raised in environments when law or freedom has been misused. Maybe there was a parent or authority figure who abused us, who impressed on us the laws, the rules, and constantly made us feel inadequate, unloved, not able to do anything right. And that will oftentimes stay with us, can lead us to feel like we're not good enough. We will lack self-confidence later on in life. And that can lead us to stagnation. It can lead us to problems with our future relationships because we don't feel loved or worthy. It can make us feel stagnant in our own academic or career journey because we don't feel like we'll ever accomplish anything because we have no confidence in ourselves. And that's just a horrible result of not receiving the proper use of law. Like, the rules have been abused by the authority figures and making us feel totally inadequate, and that will never measure up to their standards. And that, like I said, can result in that stagnation, that lack of growth, that feeling of not being worthy, not being confident. Like, it can lead that route. And it can also lead to the opposite route of total lack of any sort of, or it can lead us to the other side where maybe we begin to rebel, hate the law, hate the authority figure. We were so abused by it early in life that we don't want to have anything to do with it later on. So we just stop following the rules, even good rules. And that can lead us into problems where we get in trouble with the law. We end up hurting ourselves, hurting others, as kind of a rebellious act to the way we were treated early on. So Richard says, I'm also deeply aware of the damage that misuse of law, custom, authority, and tradition has done in human history and to personal development. I know the destructive and immature state that mere reliance on structure and authority has engendered. The anger and blindness it often brings is devastating because it takes away both necessary self-confidence and a necessary self-questioning, period. And by the way, like, not only can this happen to us early in life, but this can happen later in life. I remember in some of my early jobs having authority figures, having bosses who were very abusive in the way that they treated me, the way that they talked to me. And I even had some instances of physical abuse. It's crazy, right? That these authority figures that I had as bosses, for whatever reason, they had some sort of abuse early on. They had some poor modeling early on. And so they felt a need to continue that model or to abuse others. And so I fell under that. And so I just wanted to call it out, that poor parenting or those poor leadership models can continue today. We see them in the workplace. We know people who obviously didn't receive first half of life modeling well, and so now they're reacting against it in the way that they're treating others. Oh, and the other thing that I want to mention, so not only can there be the abuse of good laws, but there also can be the abuse of just unfair rules and laws growing up, right? Where we are being handed rules that are totally unfair, and we have every right to be breaking those rules. But sometimes because we don't have self-confidence or we're not in a situation that we can break those rules, that can be another reason why later on in life, we hate the system, we hate the rules, because we were treated so unfairly in the past that now it's hard for us to submit to rules. Even if future rules are good, it's hard to trust them sometimes, right? So it gets very complicated, and it's hard for me to actually even talk about this because I'm still kind of processing all the different ways the laws can be helpful and or hurtful to us, and then based on who's the one coming down on us. Is it a boss? Is it a parent? And how are they treating that law? It's just so complex. Richard moves on and says, when some have not been able to do the task of the first half of life well, they go back and try to do it again, and then often overdo it. This pattern is usually an inconsistent mix of old-fashioned styles and symbols with very contemporary ideologies of consumerism, technology, militarism, and individualism. So we're just talking about almost this kind of deconstruction that can happen where we look back at our life, we look back at the way we were raised, and we see all the problems in that system, in those authority figures. And so we have to then kind of break it down and then construct for ourselves kind of a new system. And Richard is saying that oftentimes as we begin to kind of create our new rules, the new way that we want to live, sometimes we can overdo it. We can build a new structure for ourselves that is maybe even too hard for us to even follow. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I'm explaining this well. Richard's saying that sometimes in the act of trying to balance ourselves out, sometimes we overdo it again. Like we didn't receive the right model early on. Maybe there was too much law, or maybe there was too much freedom in that original structure. And whatever it is, it could have been the church we went to, it could have been in the household we were in. And so in a good act of trying to repair and develop a new structure for ourselves, a new way of thinking, it's very easy to overdo it in one way or the other. Richard says, I saw this pattern in my 14 years as a jail chaplain. The inmates would invariably be overly religious, highly moralistic, and excessively legalistic, believe it or not. And many over-intellectualized everything. They would do anything to try to compensate for their dashed, maybe never developed, but publicly humiliated criminal self. It was a regressive restoration of a failed first half of life, period. I think in the attempt sometimes for us to do better, sometimes we will overdo it, right? We'll begin to do things because we feel so guilty, so inadequate, or so humiliated that we now set up for ourselves a new structure, some new rules, some things that we think are going to make us feel more worthy. And so we set up a new system. And I think that the desire to want to be better is such a good thing, right? Like wanting to do better, wanting to be a better person, like at the heart of it, like that's amazing. That's awesome. That is, we can see where the heart is at, but where we get into trouble is when we begin to then create a new system, a new structure that again is almost like punishing us because we feel like, okay, I need to do X, Y, and Z to feel more worthy. And for those of us that were raised in religious systems, I was raised in a Christian church, and there are certain practices that we do that unfortunately sometimes we think by doing those practices that somehow we're now more loved or more righteous, and that's not what those practices are about at all. Spending time in prayer, in meditation, singing songs, reading the Bible or other spiritual books, like those are all good things and they can be very, very helpful for us. But in no way do those things make us more loved. And that's sometimes the problem, is that we think that by setting up some new system, some new structure, even though it's well intended, and even though those things are good for us, the trouble is we start to equate that those righteous acts or those good acts are somehow making us better, more loved, more worthy. And it gets us in trouble because the moment we can't continue doing that strict rule-based structure, or we take a break from it, all of a sudden, like we no longer feel worthy or loved anymore because we stopped doing those practices. And I think it's interesting that Richard calls out like all these men who had done something that resulted in jail time for them. And so in a act of trying to do better, they've become like overly moralistic, excessively legalistic. And I've seen this in churches. Like I've been there. Like you don't have to be in jail to experience this. Sometimes just going to a church and being part of a new system, like to fit in or to feel like you are righteous or more righteous than others, sometimes you kind of can easily fall into these traps of being overly religious, excessively legalistic, right? And so, yeah, what we're just saying, like, I've seen it, I've done it, and you don't have to be in jail to experience this. I think this is just like, sometimes as we try to be better people, sometimes we do things that are going to set us up for failure. Because if you're living in an environment where you're being overly legalistic, at some point, you're not going to be able to follow your own rules. And then that can lead to your own failure, which can then bring you into this downward spiral of not feeling guilty. Of being guilty again, losing self-confidence, and then you're back at square one of feeling guilty again and not worthy. And that was the whole reason why you even set up the system in the beginning. Isn't it complex? Like, I apologize if I'm not explaining this well. Like, as you can tell, I'm trying to like talk this out. It's an interesting area because I see this in myself. I see this like this kind of circle behavior of you fail, you want to do better, so you set up a new system, and then you fail again, and then you feel guilty, and so you set up a new system. It's like this like constant back and forth, and it's never going to work until we like can rest in grace and the love of God. At least for me, like once I can rest in that, I can just rest in knowing that I am loved, I am divinely loved. And if I can rest in that grace, if I can rest in that love, everything else can kind of fix itself. Some of us are so hard on ourselves that just starting to rest in grace and love will help us to balance ourselves out. So after reading this from Richard, this is what I wrote down. I said, in attempting to clean up or be better people, we might try to overcompensate for our poor behavior by following strict religious rules in hopes that would make us better people and make us feel better about ourselves. Now, there's nothing wrong with following good rules or practicing prayer, meditation, Bible reading, etc. But it can become a problem when we think that those actions somehow make us more loved, more worthy of grace, which is all we really want anyways, right? The revelation we all need is that we are loved right now. We are worthy right now. And we have been divinely loved this whole time. Even in the failure, we have been loved. That's the grace. That's the gospel. This is why I love the gospel. But it's so easy to forget. It's so easy to forget the grace and the love, especially when you've been raised up in an environment where the law has been so hard on you, or you feel so guilty and weak that it's hard sometimes to accept this law, this beautiful grace. But when we can rest in it, like truly rest in it, it's a beautiful thing. Okay, so Richard gave the example of people in prison, and in the process of reforming, sometimes it's easy to fall into this trap of becoming overly religious, overly legalistic, right? In this attempt to become better people, to feel loved, to feel worthy. And now Richard's going to flip that and talk about how this happens even within the church. He says, a recent study pointed out that a strong majority of young men entering seminaries in the last 10 to 20 years came from single-parent homes, a high percentage having what we would call father wounds, which can take the form of an absent, emotionally unavailable, alcoholic, or even abusive father. Men join a male club like the church to get the male energy they never got as sons, or because they accept the male game of free enterprise and social advancement. The result is a generation of seminarians and young clergy who are cognitively rigid and risk averse, who want to circle the wagons around their imagined secure and superior group, who seem preoccupied with clothing, titles, perks, and externals of religion. None of us can know about second half of life spirituality as long as we're still trying to create the family, parenting, security, order, pride that we're not given in the first half. But there is a way to move ahead. Period. So what's interesting to me is that when I first started reading this book, and this is why the book gets so complex for me, is that I think that I'm just reading about these different stages and basically how do you move into the second stage of being more compassionate, more loving, like what does that look like? And in the process, he's talking about like how difficult it is to move into these other stages in life, these more compassionate, loving stages, if we haven't gone through the first stage. Like, how can we have deep empathy, more love, more compassion towards others if we don't have that for ourselves? Like, if the first half of our life, the way we're raised, has been altered by a misuse of law, misuse of freedom, that will make it that much more difficult for us to love ourselves, to feel confident, to feel worthy. And if we don't have that, like Richard was saying, if we don't have that ego built, if we don't have that container built properly, it's going to be harder to move on into this like second phase, which gets into that earlier point around you need to have a strong ego to begin with before it can fall apart. Like that paradox, which I'm still don't understand, but it's kind of this idea of like, I guess the way that I'm kind of understanding this is that how can we truly love others and have a deep compassion, a deep empathy if we don't have that on ourselves? If we don't love ourselves deeply and feel worthy and loved, how are we expected to be able to give that to others in our personal relationships, in our marriages, as fathers, as workers, like as people in a church? Like, you put yourself in whatever environment, if you have not had your needs met, this is such a powerful concept. And how are you supposed to give like proper love? This is why this book speaks so much to me, because there's all these gems and concepts like this that are just kind of mixed in to these chapters that just, I sit here and I just underline, I'm circling words and I'm putting stars next to things I need to think about. And these are concepts that I'll be thinking about, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, I'll still be thinking about this. Like this idea of like, if I want to love better, if I want to be more compassionate, then I need to start with myself. And I think, and that could be very, very hard for many of us. And so I don't know, like reading that section, sometimes like I'll read it and I feel like in a place of, man, I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if I can do that. Because I don't know about you, but I feel like self-love, like feeling worthy, feeling confident, like it comes in waves for me. Like sometimes I feel totally worthy and loved, and other times I can feel totally devastated. And anyways, that's the way it is for me. I go through these waves. But, reading this chapter in that section around, when you're in those moments of feeling inadequate, feeling unloved, unworthy, sometimes it can be hard to think like, how do you move on? And so I was excited when I read that line about And Richard says, but there is a way to move ahead. Because sometimes you feel, when you're in that moment of feeling unworthy, unloved, you can feel like, man, I don't know what else to do. And Richard's saying, like, there is a way to move ahead. So now Richard's going to move into this new section called Discharging Your Loyal Soldier. Okay, so Richard starts off by talking about the importance of our loyal soldier, or which is really a metaphor for our early identity, our false self. Richard says, the voice of our loyal soldier gets us through the first half of life safely, teaching us to look both ways before we cross the street, to have enough impulse control to avoid addictions and compulsive emotions, to learn the sacred no to ourselves that gives us identity, dignity, direction, significance, and boundaries. Period. So this is where it gets a little tricky, right? Because Richard's setting us up. He's been talking about all throughout this chapter and then reminding us here about how important this first half of life structure has been for us, right? These early boundaries, these early rules, they have been there to serve and protect us physically, emotionally, and even spiritually. And it gets tricky here because now you're like, what? What do you mean we're getting rid of these boundaries? What do you mean discharging your loyal soldier? How is letting go of these important boundaries and rules going to help us in the future? I don't understand this. Okay, so if you're asking that question too, let's move on, because this is where it gets really complex, and I hope I can try to explain this. I'm actually not really explaining it. I'm just processing it. I'm just trying to explain how I'm kind of taking all this in. Okay. So Richard says, paradoxically, your loyal soldier gives you so much security and validation that you may confuse his voice with the voice of God. If this inner and critical voice has kept you safe for many years as your inner voice of authority, you may end up not being able to hear the real voice of God. The loyal soldier is the voice of all your early authority figures. His or her ability to offer shame, guilt, warnings, boundaries, and self-doubt is the gift that never stops giving, period. So I think the idea here is that, number one, these boundaries, these rules, this loyal soldier metaphor has been critical for our development. It's been critical to keep us safe, keep us emotionally and physically safe. It's provided us boundaries, right? But Richard says that sometimes we might confuse those early boundaries as being something that God has given us. And it's an interesting idea, right? That sometimes we might confuse the rules and boundaries given to us by authority figures as being those rules given by God. And that may or may not be the case. I guess it really depends. But I think Richard's pointing out that there are many rules and voices and authority figures that have given us things that are not from God. I don't really know how to get into that, but it's an interesting warning, right? That we need to be careful. Richard says, normally we will not discharge our loyal soldier until he shows himself to be wanting, incapable, inadequate for the real issues of life, as when we confront love, death, suffering, subtlety, sin, mystery, and so on. It is another form of the falling and dying that we keep talking about. The world mythologies all point to places like Hades, Sheol, Hell, Purgatory, the realm of the dead. Maybe these are not so much the alternative to heaven as the necessary path to heaven, period. Okay, so this is a really important part here where Richard is talking about how our early identity, and again, he uses these metaphors of the boundaries, the rules, what he calls the container, that system that has kept us in line, basically. He says there comes a moment where we find that system that has kept us safe for so long all of a sudden doesn't work anymore. Or it hasn't kept us as safe as we thought. Because we enter into a season where all of a sudden the rules that we had followed to be safe didn't work out for us anymore. Like all of a sudden we've been traumatized by something. And everything that we've done to keep ourselves safe is now flipped. And we enter into these moments where things can spiral out of control. And we realize sometimes that who we thought God is, who we think we are, can get muddy. And again, I'm just speaking in metaphors. I'm trying to talk about this. And I apologize for not explaining this well. But, Richard says that, all the world mythologies point to places like Hades, Sheol, Hell. And you think about all these stories about, or even Jesus, and in the Apostles' Creed, says that he descended into hell, and the third day he rose again from the dead. Like all these like metaphors of like going into a hell, whatever you want to call it, that dark season where things don't make sense anymore, where life seems to be falling apart, pain, emotional pain, physical pain, you can fill in the blank. This is a season of hell, essentially, that we will all go through. Some of us have already been through and may go through again. This is part of life, unfortunately, for many of us. And during those seasons is when Richard's saying that we need, in order to get through that season, we have to kind of let go of certain things. And what Richard calls discharging your loyal soldier. And there must be some sort of closure that happens, some sort of acceptance that happens before we can move on in a proper way. I think that's some of what is going on here. I'm not entirely sure, but I guess this idea of going through these this is not just a rough patch, right? This is an actual period where everything we know seems to be falling apart. And Richard's saying, this is those moments of hell. These are these moments of when we describe Jesus as his descent into hell. And you can take that as something that really happened, or you can take it as a metaphor that he experienced such pain and distance from God that for Jesus it was an experience of hell. And this idea of entering into Hades, like sometimes we talk about, you hear stories about people who have gone to war and have witnessed so much atrocity and dealt with so much physical trauma, witnessed so many terrible things, had emotional trauma, and described it as being in hell. You've heard those stories, and you may have gone through seasons, what you would describe as hell. This is what we're talking about here. And Richard is saying, during those moments, things that we thought about ourselves, the things we thought about other people, our early identity, almost falls apart. Richard calls this section discharging your loyal soldier. Basically during this time, this letting go feels like hell. It feels like death. So now we're just going to talk about what it feels like to let go, what it feels like to discharge your loyal soldier. Richard says, when you first discharge your loyal soldier, it will feel like a loss of faith or a loss of self, but it is only the death of the false self, and is often the very birth of the soul. So instead of being ego-driven, you begin to be soul-drawn, period. It's one of those really complex topics, because I think that some of this language only makes sense for those who have gone through those experiences. If you have not gone through these moments of hell, basically, then some of these words might not make any sense, because you're reading this going, what do you mean? It feels like a loss of faith, a loss of self. But I think it's just that idea of when everything is falling apart around you and you're going through these very difficult seasons, or what a lot of people would call the dark nights of the soul. It is and can feel like a loss of yourself, a loss of faith, a loss of, you can fill in the blank, but basically you feel at loss. And Richard's saying that at those moments, this is where you are, in a sense, can be transformed. This is where Richard says you can begin to feel the draw of your true or new self. And as I was thinking about all this, because I know that this sounds bizarre, right? And Richard's trying to give language to how we kind of come out of these darker seasons. And so he's using metaphors about birth of the soul, being soul drawn, and he's just trying to give words to explain how our identity kind of changes or can change during these very difficult moments. So as I was thinking through all this, here's what I wrote down. I wrote, these dark seasons of the soul are difficult moments. It's as if we're consumed, overtaken by a cocoon. We're entangled and trapped, and we don't have the physical or emotional ability to break out. We don't know how long or even how to endure this cocoon. These are periods that wreck us and can lead us to a loss of faith, a loss of love, and even a loss of self. These are also periods that can lead us to bitterness, anger, and abuse of ourselves, abuse of others. And what's really hard is that our go-to strategies don't work anymore. Prayers feel empty. Our friendships, our close relationships can dissolve, and we can feel entirely alone. These are those dark seasons, those dark moments of the soul, and we can never be ready for them. Breaking out from these seasons, to me, feels like a transformation happens. I don't really think of it as a rebirth, although I think that metaphor works. But I think it's really that we're transformed, that we developed new eyes, new hearts, minds that I think have more empathy now, more compassion, a new view of ourselves, a new view of our life's direction, a new view of our purpose. I would hope a deeper love for others, a deeper love for God. I think that when we can come out of these darker seasons, having this kind of new transformation, and it can take years to get to this point, by the way. I think that depending on how traumatic these dark nights of the soul are, how long they last, and then the time that we need to heal, like who knows how long that will be. But because in the healing process, like you can be feeling bitter and in pain and all the things that come with that, and you're still needing time to heal. But Richard is talking about like at the end, after the healing, you could begin to be feeling this, what he calls being soul drawn. And I heard a lecture from Richard recently, and he said that he thinks that most people during their final stages of life get to this point, even if it's just days or hours before they die, just from his talks with end of life care workers, and from his visits to people who are dying in hospitals. He says that he thinks that most people will get to this point. But I think the unfortunate thing is that sometimes we don't get this point until way late in life. Like if we could begin to have these transformed views, these deeper forms of compassion and empathy earlier in life, it would serve us better. It would serve our world better. It could help us serve others better if we could, I guess, get to this deeper stage earlier in life. Like we can do so much good with it. But we're all on different paths, and we're all going to deal with different events in our own way. And like I said, like these moments, like there's no preparation for them. And so, this is not meant to be some sort of like thing that we're competing for. Like, oh, I just want to get through this traumatic event so I can have these new eyes, this kind of enter into this second half of life. Like, it's not a race. And whether or not, it's not a race. It's not a race at all. But Richard's just trying to explain like what happens during these darker seasons. And this is why I found this chapter and these upcoming sections on this dark night of the soul so helpful. Because when I was going through my own dark seasons, like I wasn't really aware of what people had written about these dark nights of the soul. I didn't even know it existed. All I knew was like that people go through hell, people go through hard times, and then you kind of like climb your way out of it eventually, hopefully. That's all I kind of knew going in. But I had no idea that there was so much written and spiritual conversation around these dark moments. Like I had read like some of the Psalms of David where he's talking about his very hard moments and feeling like he's in hell and feeling like God is gone. And I knew the account of Jesus being on the cross and crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And this feeling that Christ was descending into a hellish period. Like, so I was aware of those stories, but it never really clicked with me that I would go through my own season, and I'll have future seasons of this. And that there was like conversation around it, that there were books about that. Like, I didn't know any of that's existed. So this is why this book was so helpful to me, because when I started to read this, I was like, yes, I know what you're talking about. I get this. I totally understand this. And when Richard was talking about like, after these moments, we can move from being ego driven to being soul drawn. I was like, oh man, I hope that's me. I hope that I'm changed for the better. Like I will come out of this with more compassion because I don't want to stay bitter. I don't want to stay angry. I want to be a better person out of all of this. I want to be a more compassionate person. And so, yeah, I totally, like when I was reading this, I was like, yes, it is hell. Yes, I understand. And so, when you're going through this book, like there is a lot of metaphor, and for some of it, it's going to speak to us. It's going to speak to us deeply. And for others, we might just skip through it because we haven't felt that yet, or that metaphor doesn't make sense yet. But I think just having early exposure to this can be helpful, because I know that the next time I go through another season, like I'll be running back to these books, and I'm sure that these words, these metaphors are going to take on a new meaning. And that's what is so beautiful about poetry. This is why I'm so attracted to spiritual writing, because these things can take new meanings over time. And I think, and these can be deeper meanings that will help us through these seasons. Okay. I also wrote this. I said, spiritually, we might call these dark nights of the soul, these periods of feeling faithless, or even feelings of atheism, like all valid feelings. We're just trying to get through and understand, like, how could this happen, right? And so I wrote down that, spiritually, we might call this season a period of deconstruction or even reconstruction of what we believe about God, what we believe about the world or of ourselves. But I don't think it's not like an absolute deconstruction, because we're not starting from scratch. We are developing a framework based around what we've gone through, what early church traditions, other things that what Richard calls the perennial tradition. Like, we're going to be grabbing systems and beliefs from what has been helpful to other people, what has been helpful to us during these seasons. And what I found was interesting is that some of the older traditions, at least spiritually, that I didn't think paid much attention to, and maybe sounded odd to me earlier in my own spiritual journey, all of a sudden some of these older things became interesting. And some of these doctrines I now embraced, like they made more sense to me after going through some of these seasons. So anyway, I just wanted to talk about that, because not only is so much happening during these dark nights of the soul, during these periods of transformation or rebirth, whatever you want to call it, like it can happen on so many different levels. And for me, on a spiritual level, I found that I had to kind of look back at the things I believed about myself, about God, about the Bible, and had to develop a newer system, or basically take some taking some older ideas, and now older ideas that I didn't really hold to, and now they kind of made more sense to me. And so, anyways, I know I'm not explaining this well, but basically, I think during these periods is where, when transformation is happening, it can happen in many areas of our life. And part of growing, part of adapting means that our ideas are going to shift, and that's okay. And I hope that the direction that we all head in, and I hope the direction I'm heading in, is that I am becoming in all aspects a more loving person. I hope that's the case. Richard goes on and says, St. John of the Cross taught that God has to work in the soul in secret and in darkness, because if we fully knew what was happening and what mystery, transformation, God, grace will eventually ask of us, we would either try to take charge or stop the whole process. No one oversees his or her own demise willingly, even when it is the false self that is dying. Period. I mean, I don't know about you, but during those moments, during those really dark seasons, I feel like the furthest point away from God, and even doubting his existence. Like, that's me. And St. John of the Cross is saying, like, in these really dark moments, this is where God is working in us. He's there the whole time. And it's very, very interesting, because I guess, like, man, you think about it, like the moments when God is working on us, when these like big transformations are happening, are during these like moments when sometimes we think that he's so distant. And in my case, sometimes I'm feeling like there is no God, because how could God be allowing X, Y, and Z? How could I be feeling like this? It's interesting. So Richard moves on and talks about the need for closure. And this is really kind of the end of this chapter on the first half of life. Is this, in order to move on from these major, hard transformations, these transitions, we need closure. And he says there's a kind of closure that is much needed for most of us at the end of all major transitions in life, because we have lost any sense of the need for such rites of passage. Most of our people have no clear crossover to the second half of their own lives. No one shows us the stunted and limited character of the worldview of the first half of life. So we just continue with more of the same. There is little talk of journeys outward or onward, the kind of journeys Jesus called people to go on. Period. So not only do we need closure to properly move on, but we also need to realize that there is a new journey for us to take, a new path that's opened, that's ready for us. But to enter this new journey, it means basically letting go. And so I know that we've covered a lot in this chapter. There's been a lot of metaphor, and a lot of this as you can tell, I'm trying to grasp. But I think the thing that I really appreciate from this chapter is that there is a path, there is a journey, that the things that helped build us up to this point, when we feel like, man, life is falling apart, the things I thought were true don't seem to be true anymore, the things I had felt don't feel real anymore, that we're not alone, and that people have written about these experiences and have talked about how they've gotten through these experiences and how these moments have helped shape them for the better. And I know that doesn't sound, it doesn't sound real, or it sounds like too cliche, like, oh, really? Like, good comes from the bad. But I think that what these really poor, terrible experiences can do is it can shape us in a positive way if we allow it. Because we can certainly move into the other direction of feeling bitter, angry, and totally be justified in that belief. But I hope that all of us would move into the direction of having more compassion, having more empathy, and finding ways to help others in our world. So we've now just finished this chapter on the first half of life, and we've covered a lot so far. And so now we're moving into this new area on the dark night of the soul. In fact, the next group of chapters is all about this season and how do we understand it? How do we go through it? What have others said about these dark nights of the soul? Richard calls it necessary suffering, a bright sadness, the shadowlands. He uses all these chapter titles that we're going to go through are all about this period. And I have found these next group of chapters to be hard-hitting. I have found them to be super helpful in my own spiritual formation, in my own understanding of these darker seasons and what they mean. So I'm excited to go through them with you. Thank you for listening to my random thoughts on this chapter. I hope it has been helpful in some way. I know it's helpful to me to talk about it because I'm still, as you can tell, trying to understand the details, and I'm missing a lot. And we'll chat next time on the next chapter called The Tragic Sense of Life. Take care.